we're really excited to talk to everyone about this topic, shaping public space through resiliency. As a multidisciplinary office at E&LP with landscape architects, civil engineers, planners, surveyors, geotechnical engineers, all working together, trying to figure out how to implement resilient practices into public space projects is near and dear to all of our hearts and part of our company's mission. So we're excited to share our approach and how we do that here today. I'm gonna start off with a video here that hopefully will warm everyone up and get everyone in tune to the discussion.
Resiliency is the ability to recover quickly from natural disasters.
Physical resiliency can be somewhat easy to define. It's our infrastructure systems and how well they respond in the face of large catastrophic natural events.
Social resiliency is the ability of a community to make it through a tough time.
Are they going to have property damage afterwards? Are they going to have insurance increases? Are they going to have parks and public spaces that are unusable for weeks at a time? So if we think about the physical resiliency in such a way that it's occupiable by people, we can mitigate those issues and make sure that they do have a beautiful place to come back to or rally around in the event of a natural crisis. I think it's important because I think recent history has shown with events like Hurricane Sandy that we've made an impact on the Earth, and the Earth is going to continue to make an impact back on us. Frequency of large storm events is increasing, days are getting hotter, and more people are moving into urban areas where some of these conditions can get exacerbated.
I think municipalities are starting to realize the importance of resiliency being integrated into their land development ordinances. Some municipalities, it's already taken place. We're seeing more green build checklists, energy efficient checklists. A lot of it is optional at this point, but I think as time progresses and we really see the value in the results from this, they're going to start to convert to more mandatory ordinances.
So as we design, we need to design infrastructure not for now, but for the future. If we design for today, we're actually going to spend a whole lot of money on something that's going to fail in 20 to 50 years. But if we design for 20, 50 years, 100 years out, then we're allowing communities to be resilient, not having to rebuild after a large storm event.
While it's beneficial to the environment, I think what we're going to start seeing is the long-term benefits to the developers by actually incorporating these items as the environment changes.
So I think it's on us as the design community to be as cutting edge and efficient and resilient as possible with the work we're doing. I think we need to rise to the challenge and have work that accommodates all modes of resiliency, both social and physical.
All right, so hope everyone is warmed up after that. Here today, it's myself. My name is Ed Confair. I'm the Senior Program Manager for Resiliency at E&LP Associates. What that means is I get to work on all of the cool projects where we get to incorporate green infrastructure into public space. And as both a civil engineer and landscape architect, that's kind of my dream. So I'm happy to share that work with you here today. I'm gonna let my colleague introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Megan Schmidt. I'm a project engineer out of the Philadelphia office for E&LP. I love working on projects that Ed loves working on. So green infrastructure and public spaces excite me. And when we get to combine them, that's a really impressive project for me.
So we've got three main principles that we've kind of structured our presentation around today that kind of summarize our approach to this topic of incorporating resiliency in the public space. So number one is, a really big picture planning perspective, really at the government level. We're going to show a couple examples about how that happens, often before even we as designers get to come into a project. Principle two is defining criteria. Resilient landscapes and public spaces need to be performative. And so it's important to know both from a physical and social stance, what type of criteria you're trying to meet. And then number three is really for all the designers that are listening in, the fun part where you get to put all of that due diligence and information gathering together into developing really cool public spaces. So starting off number one here, we're going to look at a few examples of developing resilient strategic planning initiatives and carrying those out, both from a physical and social infrastructure perspective. And, you know, one of the kind of mission statements or credo we've used in our work, this is straight from one of our projects, the Northwest Resiliency Park in Hoboken, is just that as communities are growing and transforming, they're becoming these really vibrant places to live, work, play. And so our growth and design has got to be just as dynamic, and we've still got to maintain preparedness. We've still got to prepare for what we don't know is coming 20, 30, 50 years in the future. And we've got to keep in mind the physical environment and the social context in which we're working. And we kind of summarize that in-house and really use this as a social resilience plus physical resilience perspective on how to design.
So looking at Philadelphia, we can kind of get an idea of how holistic planning can get adopted and how it can evolve over the years. So here's a summary of some of Philadelphia's sustainability policy. Obviously not all of it, but some major points in the last 2 decades. So starting in 1999, Philadelphia joined the Cities for Climate Action Plan, and this was to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases by 10% from the 1990 levels to 2010. In 2005, they made further commitment to reduce greenhouse gases in the US Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. And here they set not only more stringent standards for greenhouse gas reduction, but also urged state and federal governments to enact policies to enforce it. In 2007, Executive Order 107 was signed by Mayor John Street. And this one was specifically targeted at new development in the city. So any new building meeting a certain threshold would have to meet a more stringent standard for sustainability. New buildings had to get LEED Silver certification. They also had to reduce energy consumption by at least 20% over city building codes. And then in 2009, Greenworks Philadelphia was adopted, and this is more of a vision policy, which is important in any planning process to understand what the vision of sustainability is for the city. So it was encapsulated a lot of ideas and not so much specific policy, but this guided the vision going forward. In 2011, Green City Clean Waters was adopted, and this was a major step for stormwater management in the city. If you've worked with stormwater management in Philadelphia, you've probably heard of it. It's a 25-year planning document to invest in stream and river health in the city, where the city used to have a lot of tributaries and they were since buried by development. So this process was adopting stormwater management policy that would clean these systems and also introduce a lot of green infrastructure. And then in 2012, Green Streets Design Manual was another important step. It's a companion document to the Complete Streets guidance that the city set. And the idea was that public and private projects were becoming more resilient, incorporating green infrastructure, but now we can connect these properties through resilient infrastructure and roadways. So here you can see just a few examples of the many green infrastructure projects throughout the city. It's hard to walk through the city and not see one. So in the center, you can see Philadelphia Navy Yard. In the bottom left, you'll see Sarah Green. And bottom right, you'll see Fairmount Waterworks Basin. And these are just very few of the many projects that you'll see of successful green infrastructure implementation. So Philadelphia is not the only city making these efforts. Throughout the world, countries, cities, states have all adopted different guidance policies for designing stormwater management systems and becoming more resilient. Today, we're going to take a more specific look at the city of Hoboken and how its master plan goes from planning to reality.
So thank you, Megan. So Hoboken, New Jersey, just like with Philadelphia, this is a repeatable process for any governing body that wants to undertake a holistic approach to resiliency planning at any level of government, really. So, just like in Philadelphia, the early 2000s, Hoboken is very flood prone, and they started to look at their master plan and identify parkland and public space that could contribute to a long-term vision of resiliency planning. They really followed through a decade later by realizing and adopting their green infrastructure strategic plan, which starts to identify specific sites throughout the city that can help them achieve certain performance criteria. One in particular is a large 6-acre lot in the northwest of the city, which became the site for the Hoboken Northwest Resiliency Park. Hoboken is also a key city participating in the Rebuild by Design effort, and they're one of the few cities that partook in that effort that is following through with the implementation of the ideas and designs that came out of it. In 2017, they took action to actually purchase land to build a resiliency park on, and in 2019, the North Hudson Sewer Authority, which is a key contributor and partner in this effort, adopted and adapted their long-term control plan for CSO reduction, featuring a key piece of infrastructure in this park. So this is a look at the strategic planning document for green infrastructure. You know, they took a approach of looking at elevation-wise what's in the city. Hoboken kind of has an elevated ridge running north-south in the city, and then it drops off until along the western edge of the city, you're really down in what was historically marsh and swampland. So the city identified different appropriate green infrastructure BMPs that could work at those different level elevations and risk of flood throughout the city, and that created a framework on how to move forward with design projects in any one of those areas. So physical infrastructure planning. Remember, we're looking at physical and social and how they tie together. So we're going to start with physical planning here in Hoboken. So Hoboken, this is the outline. It's about 1 square mile. You can see this small blue rectangle is the site of the Northwest Resiliency Park. This is kind of a blow up looking at specific sewer sheds in the North Hudson Sewerage Authority District. The purple dots you can see here are different CSO outfalls. So it's a combined sewer overflow for anyone who hasn't heard the term before. And so, you know, you really started looking at what's the whole sewer shed, and then you start to see what are the sewer sheds that can be affected by an infrastructure planning initiative that's local, and that's the first step. You tie that in with the planning that was done through Rebuild by Design, again, looking at more localized flooding along specific streets and corridors and sections of the city. And then starting to identify specific locations and partials that could contribute to a citywide flood mitigation strategy. This is a view of what the park looked like in 2017 before a temporary pop-up park was installed on it. This is a site with over 100 years of industrial use and contamination and historic fill on it. And it was and is still going to be an environmentally capped site. So looking at that history, you can see we're kind of trying to point out where the site is through historic photos and aerials. See, for a long time, this area of the city is not developed. It's on marshland. And there's a history of chemical and industrial companies that carried out various work and facility on the site through its history. Again, even in the 1930s, this area of the city is still not really developed or built up. And then eventually you get to 2017. It was a very important transition for the city, for everyone and the residents to start thinking of this site as not just a fenced off former industrial lot, but as a public space. And so they invested time and money into putting a temporary pop-up park to change the narrative around this site and set the stage for the permanent installation that was to follow. So, you know, fast forward in 2017, you know, E&LP was lucky enough to lead a talented team, design team with Olin and architects, a number of other contributing members to undertake this project. And we really went through a 3-year process of design and public planning and public engagement to figure out what was the appropriate way to develop this site. And again, we were looking at the start very broadly across whole districts of the city from a large flood mitigation perspective. We knew what CSOs would be affected by any type of mitigation strategies or infrastructure implementation in the various sewer sheds, and that was step one. Step two is we also knew that there was localized flooding issues, that we could put large below grade infrastructure that could address CSO overflows, but we still needed an approach for at grade surface level green infrastructure that could address the immediate neighborhood nuisance flooding. And so we really ended up with a dual stormwater management approach in that regard. That kind of brings us to the social infrastructure planning. Again, high level, looking largely at the city, what's in a quarter mile, half mile, and really when you expand to a full mile radius, almost the whole city is within walkable distance of this park. So it's not just a neighborhood park, this is serving the whole city and potentially some of the surrounding neighborhoods as well. We did an extensive needs assessment on figuring out programmatically what was in the city and what wasn't. It was important with 6 acres. This is the last large piece of land in Hoboken that the city got all of the bang for their buck with what they put here. Just from a space constraints perspective, there's certain things such as athletic facilities that could only fit on a parcel of this size and couldn't fit on some of the remaining land. It was also important to see what the city wanted that they didn't have enough of. So this park had to serve a lot of masters and a lot of goals, and you'll see how we tackled meeting that expectation. We also looked development-wise. You can see in the purple here, along the west end of the city, fittingly called the West End Development, and along the north called the North End Development. These are 2 targeted redevelopment zones of the city. They're either vacant lots or kind of land banked with temporary buildings or old warehouses or bus parking. And the city wants to see those developed. So we needed to not only look at the park currently, but plan for future development and pressures that might come online down the road. And then public engagement was extremely important. I can't emphasize enough how extensive, it was really almost a year of various stages of information gathering and meeting the public where they were at. We worked with the city to brand the park, to brand a logo for the park. We got t-shirts made up. Everyone knew both city and design team professionals when we showed up in our bright blue t-shirts to interact with them and ask them questions about what they wanted to see in their park. We went to every public engagement scenario that the city had available for us to attend, harvest festivals, track runs, local parks and rec events, soccer games, just trying to make sure we were hitting all demographics and age groups to get feedback on what they wanted to see in the park. We had standard stage meetings where city professionals would speak in tandem with our design team, and we'd get into on-table drawing and modeling and charrette discussions. One of the more interesting approaches that we took is, for anyone who's a design professional on the line and has done public charrettes, often we're using a plan that has to scale elements for buildings or parks or basins or parking lots. And we're kind of moving those around in configurations. For this project, since we knew the infrastructure both below and at grade was going to be so important, we tried for the first time to really flip that into a section view so people could move around trees, playground elements, benches, lighting, pavilion structures, etc. in section and kind of play with them elevationally. And we could kind of talk about the restrictions of having below grade stormwater management with programming at grade in finished park amenities. And that really helped, I think, break down a barrier of what could work in tandem together and how infrastructure could be incorporated in interesting, unique, and innovative ways with finished park amenities. We constantly tallied our survey results from our public engagement. So again, we came up with a consistent graphic language and just continued to use it and track month to month what people were looking for. It's very interesting, kind of the most positive things, trees, everyone was extremely excited to see about that. But we sort of realized that, what people want most are the basic amenities. Of course, the park is going to have bathrooms, it's going to have water fountains, it's going to have benches and place for bikes. So we were able to kind of engage with the public early and say, yes, you're going to have all those basic things. Those are no-brainers, they're automatics. And then we were really, subsequent months able to focus the discussion on what are the other must-haves that are unique. Do you want a water feature? Do you want it to be seasonal? Do you want a dog park? Do you want a mini golf green? Do you want a playground for all ages? So some of the more specific items, we were able to kind of guide the discussion to get to the bottom of what people really wanted to see. We ended up kind of developing 4 buckets of where the ultimate, programmatic nature of the park needed to land. There were the natural elements, the incorporation of green infrastructure, shade, native gardens, pollinator gardens, a natural woody vegetation setting. Culture, that the park was a civic center, there needed to be community space, there needed to be a cafe building, there needed to be comfort amenities. Athletic facilities, again, at 6 acres, it was really the city's last chance to put in any type of multi-use athletic facility. And play, it really came out that it was important that this was a multi-generational park that had play not only for Hoboken's youngest, but Hoboken's oldest as well. And we really tried to accomplish, to integrate an all ages play approach in the final design. So that brings us to defining point number 2. And I'm going to turn it back over to Megan.
So the idea here is to move from a more holistic planning view to a site-specific view, and guiding principle 2 describes that approach. It's to define design and performance criteria for both physical infrastructure systems as well as community-based social interdependencies. So we were looking at how we could meet these targets, and these can vary in what they mean by performance criteria, but what we look at is regulations, certifications, and metrics. So when I say certifications, I mean sustainability certifications in this context. These can be very commonly building certifications. You might be familiar with the Living Building Challenge or LEED credit. That's a system that many people know about. You get different points to get an accreditation of different levels based on what elements you incorporate into your building, what materials, what energy systems. Other certifications that might apply to a site can include appliance certifications, materials, and landscaping. The Sustainable Sites Initiative is something that we most commonly work with, and I'll talk a little bit about this when I discuss the Northwest Resiliency Park, but it's essentially a leave it equivalent for everything outside of the building to guide resilient design. There are also a number of regulatory agencies that will set metrics for a site. So on a local level in Philadelphia, if you're working with stormwater, you're probably going to encounter Philadelphia Water Department. Any development over a certain size will trigger their review, and you'll have to meet the standards that they set forth. They have very detailed standards that they've adopted and adapted as they learn more about systems. You may also encounter Philadelphia Streets Department, Zoning and Planning, and a number of other local agencies. On a state level, you might see the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, the Department of Transportation. It really varies on what you're designing. And on a federal level, agencies like the EPA and FEMA may play a role in your design decisions. And then looking at site-specific metrics. These can be a little more interesting and also challenging. They're not set by a regulatory agency. They're set by the stakeholders, the design team, the community, and the client. And they can be both for physical and social aspects of the site. So these word clouds here are just a few of the many, many metrics that could apply to a site. And we'll look at some of these and how they apply to 2 E&LP projects specifically. So the first one I'll discuss is the Temple University East Park Canoe House. This one is in Philadelphia, right between the Schuylkill River and Kelly Drive. So several regulatory agencies did review this project. The project was over a certain disturbance level and triggered both Philadelphia Water Department review and the DEP. And they each set different metrics for what you needed to do for soil erosion and stormwater, just to ensure the site was meeting the local and state standards. This also triggered Pennsylvania Department of Transportation review because it opened up onto Kelly Drive. There were no specific certifications for this site, so we didn't have anything that we were trying to meet in terms of LEED or site certifications. But we had a number of physical and social metrics that we were looking at to make the site more resilient. So from a flood management perspective, here was a big physical challenge. It's entirely within the floodplain, so we are working on managing these floodwaters right as they run off into the Schuylkill River. The important part about setting targets is to understand your existing conditions. So on the left, you'll see a map of how water flows across the site in pre-development conditions. And on the right, you'll see two bar graphs. On the left one is the pre-development and the right one is post-development. On the left, you can see that none of the stormwater was being managed in pre-development conditions. It was either going directly into the sewer systems or directly into the river. So we then set targets on how much water we were going to manage, and we did it largely through green infrastructure systems. So throughout the site, there were large, shallow bioretention basins, and I'll talk a little bit more about what guided that decision. Another physical metric for the site was a high groundwater table. We had to design basins where the groundwater was very shallow. So during pre-design, we did soil testing as you do for most stormwater projects. And then we designed basins to meet the criteria that they were a certain distance from the groundwater table. Of course, nothing goes exactly how you plan it to go. So during construction, we found that the groundwater table was even higher than the soil testing showed. So on the left, you can see some ponding where we encountered the groundwater table. This meant that we had to adapt our metrics during construction, redesign the basins so they were shallower and larger in footprint. They had to catch the same amount of volume of water in a much shallower basin. So on the right, you can see that this is the basin right after installation. If you go visit now, you'll see that the vegetation has really matured and filled out the basin. I mentioned soil testing. Another challenge was that there was a low infiltration rate. So we had to manage the same amount of volume, but we couldn't infiltrate into the soil. So that meant larger systems, and it also meant incorporating liners so that we could ensure the water was going where it needed to go. From a social perspective, we had a number of metrics, one of them being connectivity. This site is located right in the middle of the Schuylkill River Trail. So this is a major connecting route for Philadelphia pedestrians, bikers, and joggers. And we needed to ensure that we maintained that route and that it was integrated into a larger planning system. This site had a very specific active recreation requirement. It was a canoe house. So we're managing large-scale events at Temple University's regattas, and also being able to store all the boats that needed to be stored. So on the upper right, you can see that this is the final design. After installation, there's a stone amphitheater. In existing or pre-development conditions, there was no amphitheater and the crowd would just gather on the lawn. I know it's very strange to think about crowds right now, but everybody packed together. It was hard to get a good view. So the final design incorporated a more optimal crowd and audience platform. And then the bottom, you can see that this is an aerial image during a regatta event. There is a very large volume of boats. And not only did we need to accommodate the storage of these boats, but we also needed to provide accessibility for them to get to the docks. They're not like pedestrians. It's a little harder to maneuver them through the paths. So that was another social design challenge for this project. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about how regulations, certifications, and metrics applied to the Northwest Resiliency Park, which Ed discussed earlier. So looking more at site-specific metrics here. These are construction photos just taken a few weeks ago. They're installing a giant subsurface detention basin, which I'll get to in a little. This site did have sustainability certifications that we needed to meet, set by the client. So we were going for a Site Silver certification. The interesting thing about this program is that a lot of what the credits that you can achieve were already incorporated into our design process. Site certifications encapsulate what it really means to be resilient outside of the building. So we did things like incorporate above and beyond stormwater management, community engagement. We connected existing transportation routes, and we incorporated flood management. From a regulatory perspective, we had a number of agencies involved in this project. For instance, at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection pre-application meeting, We had members from land use, water quality, New Jersey Infrastructure Bank, wastewater discharge, site remediation, government relations, and a number of others, all at the table. We had to meet all of their regulations, which was a big collaboration between the city government, the state government, and our design team. We also had to meet federal site remediation standards of the EPA. We had to get permits from the Hudson-Essex-Passaic Soil Conservation District to permit our disturbance. And we also had the North Hudson Sewerage Authority really involved in the project, not so much in a reviewing capacity, but in a partnership. We were incorporating their long-term control plan goals, but also working with them to install a physical pump station on the site. So looking at the metrics for the site, this was a physical metric. We needed to provide flood management. And we did this on a city scale and a local scale. On a city scale, Ed discussed this earlier, but we were looking at reducing the amount of combined sewer overflow events for the city. We did so through a 1 million gallon subsurface detention basin installed below grade on the site. And the goal here was to reduce the amount of sewage that would flow directly into the river during large storm events. So the subsurface detention basin was, it was something that it's a tool to manage floodwaters, and we had to look at it for all the different possible metrics and really optimize what we were getting out of this system. That included looking at space efficiency, cost, maintenance feasibility, installation feasibility, buoyancy calculations. Would this work with our environmental cap? Here you can see 4 different options and how they laid out on the site. So we had concrete chambers, pipes and gravel beds, stackable rain tanks, and concrete arches. And each of them had different footprints on the site to store the same amount of volume. In addition to space efficiency, there was all the other metrics that I had discussed. So we made a matrix to see which options gave us the most benefits. And that ended up being concrete chambers followed by concrete arches. So those are the larger scale city flood management tools. Now we're looking more on a local scale. What happens more often? What happens when a normal rainstorm comes to the site? So you'll see a graph here. This shows that 90% of rainfall events in the last 10 years were under an inch of rainfall accumulation. So that's what we're designing for on the surface of the site. And we approach this through the use of dispersed green infrastructure systems. To understand how we were going to manage it, we looked at the topography of the site through detailed survey, identified low points and high points. And then we took those drainage areas that we mapped out and we modeled them in hydroflow using NOAA rainfall data to understand where the existing conditions were. And in New Jersey, you have set reductions you need to meet for the 2-year, 10-year, and 100-year storms. So even before we started stormwater management, we knew what the target was for peak flows off the site. Another major physical criteria for the site was soil management. So the site is contaminated. You can see here mapped the constituents of concern, BCEEs and PCBs on site. We had to provide environmental capping to state and federal regulation standards. And the goal here was to reduce the cost to the city by keeping as much soil on site as possible, because it's expensive to excavate 20 feet of soil and ship it off site. So the approach here was to balance cut with fill. So on the left, you'll see the existing asphalt cap. There's very little topography on the existing site. But we knew that we needed to, for instance, install a 1 million gallon storage tank. So that's a lot of cut that we needed to balance with fill. And the idea with the fill is that it would create interesting topography across the site that could be incorporated into play features and park amenities. One element that interacted with this topography was the cafe building. And we had to look at how we could get it as far out of the base flood elevation set by the city as possible. We wanted to make sure that we minimize the amount of floodproofing needed. So you'll see different elevation studies here of how that could be achieved. Different slopes, what was realistic on the site. And then we looked at the site and where this where these models could be realistically incorporated. So we mapped out the location of where the building would go. We ultimately decided on a hybrid of raising the topography and floodproofing part of the building because it wasn't realistic to push the building entirely out of the base flood elevation and maintain park amenities. In terms of social criteria for the site, budget management played a huge role. It plays a huge role in any public project, especially looking at a municipality. They have a set budget of what they can spend. We were lucky to work with Hoboken, who had funding partners, both for loans and grants. So in terms of loans, we had the New Jersey Infrastructure Bank, NJEIT, and they provide low interest loans on certain types of infrastructure. So during the budgeting process, we had to separate green infrastructure from gray infrastructure from other site amenities and figure out how much of the loan that we were eligible for. It also set a timeline for the project because we needed to complete the design and get it approved before the end of the fiscal year. We also were able to get grants from the Open Space Fund for the county, as well as FEMA, who gave us $10 million for the project. The city continues to apply for different grants even as the project's constructed. Another social factor was maintaining accessibility. So this park was designed for people of all ages and all demographics. We needed it to be accessible to everyone. So this meant fine grading the entire site, ensuring that major pathways were ADA accessible. This that you'll see on screen is a detailed plan of raised intersections around the site. These were the entrances to the project. And it was challenging because the existing topography in the roadway created localized low points and there was existing infrastructure. So incorporating ADA accessible routes from adjacent streets and work with the existing grade was a challenge. And then as Ed mentioned, there was a lot of public engagement. So we understood the public programming needs for the site and how this project would be socially resilient. This is a matrix evaluating different site features for what they could provide for the site to meet park needs. And looking at another social aspect is maintaining adequate transportation on a vehicular level for bikers and for pedestrians. That's a complex transportation study, and you can see on the left side, the city had decided early on that 12th Street would be closed between the two parcels of the park. So they're re-emphasizing transportation needs of pedestrians over vehicular needs. We studied different ways of how the vehicular transportation could adapt to this change. And then on the bottom right, you'll see that a pedestrian study was also done. We incorporated different bikeways in the roads and different striping to indicate how we could safely accommodate bikers around the site. Now I'll just hand it back to Ed to get to our third guiding principle.
Thank you, Megan. That was a great look at two projects that really went above and beyond to incorporate resilient strategies into two awesome public spaces. And we're going to continue to build on that here in the third section of the presentation. And so that's understanding the opportunities for incorporation. So you've done all this work at the strategic planning level. You're now you're designing a project. You've spent months, if not years, reaching out to the public to do all that due diligence, understanding the regulatory framework you're in. And now you want to use what you know and those constraints to leverage them the best way possible and come out with a really creative and fun place at the end of the day. So, here's a couple examples that we want to give to show what that end product could start to look like. Again, on our theme of social resiliency plus physical resiliency, for the Hoboken project, even during the RFP phase, our design team had this idea of having a one-for-one match of any type of infrastructure element with any type of social amenity or programming. And so all the way back in the RFP, we really think this is, what won us the project, was showing them that we had already thought out all the different types of BMPs that they can use. This is going to be a resiliency park. There are a well-established kit of tools out there for green infrastructure BMPs. And we pre-planned, what are the type of amenities and programs that would dovetail with these and work well, whether that's a playground with a bioretention basin, a basketball court with permeable pavement, a water feature that becomes a stormwater basin when it's empty. Those were the types of ideas that we had and we wanted to sell the city on, to get the project in the first place. So before we dive into a few more examples, just want to show our second video to set the stage one more time.
The new stormwater rule is great for municipalities. It allows them to incorporate green infrastructure into their public amenities. Green infrastructure helps turn what was formerly just a stormwater management hole in the ground into a resource for communities.
It can be incorporated into smaller systems that give you, more design capabilities. You can incorporate parks into your stormwater system. You can incorporate bump outs in your streetscape. Your ballpark can be designed to have stormwater underneath. You can have play areas that institute stormwater through them. It's an interactive experience. The children can come, they can play with the water. Really get creative in beautifying your city with stormwater and really benefit the community.
So we often hear green infrastructure meets the triple bottom line. The triple bottom line is environmental, community, and economic benefits. Environmental benefits, you're providing pollinator habitats. You are cooling down surrounding areas, which makes it habitable for both humans and animals alike. Community benefits include creating recreational spaces, reducing crime rates, and even improving public health. And the third component of triple bottom line is economic benefits. So green infrastructure has the ability to improve property values and attract more people to businesses. Economic benefits also include green job creation, maintenance, installation, construction, and design.
So you get a beautification, you get some really cool site features. There's a lot of added benefit by using a green infrastructure approach.
All right, so just real quick off the top here before doing a deeper dive, just some examples of stuff we've got in the works. This is a project in Paterson, New Jersey, along the Great Falls National Historic Park. It's the Quarry Lawn Project, where there is an old excavated quarry. It has a lot of old dye houses from the Allied Textile Mill district that was there. And we're reusing all of the old historic runnels that were used previously for dyeing at the turn of the century, and now reusing them as green infrastructure, rain gardens, basins, or bioswales to manage stormwater on the park and turn it into a passive space for the city. This could take the form of a small project that we have in Allentown, where there's the Sergeant George Memorial Ashby Park. We're making sure all of the pavement in the site is porous, as well as proposing that the monument is actually set in a field of pollinator gardens and natural meadow landscape. So again, just trying to introduce sustainability and resiliency wherever you can, even if it's a small local project that doesn't have a big population, you can still bring resiliency to the community. Something as small as one of our smallest projects is a children's garden at Over the Rainbow Nursery School in Montclair, New Jersey. We turned the school had this idea of a stumpery where kids, their parents could bring stumps that they found on their property or when trees came down and kind of watch the natural decay process. And we thought that would be great to put in the low area of the garden and turn it into a rain garden feature. So the rain garden is planted with sedges, ferns, other appropriate plant palettes, and then it's also got all of these cool gnarly stumps kind of dotted around it, and it's a key education feature for the school. So we get them as young as preschool age. It's never too early to start them on the resiliency path. And then locally, I'm sure a number of people on the phone have worked with the Community Design Collaborative. It's a great organization. Participating in their charrettes can be a really rejuvenating design exercise, and it really allows you to engage with the community. So this is James Dobson Elementary School in Manayunk. It's one of the first projects we did with the collaborative. And again, we came up with a feature of this long linear, what we called a rain channel along this back blue wall on the site. Again, everything was sheet flowing to this wall. It's in the existing condition, just handled by 2 very small inlets which often overflow or get filled up with debris and cease to function. And so we had the idea of you have a bioretention long linear feature and you adapt the program along it, whether that's a outdoor classroom deck with a chalkboard wall or different types of check dam with seating or bleachers that cantilever over it, looking out over a basketball court. Those are just some quick guides, and then we're going to return to our main case study that we've been reviewing here, the Northwest Resiliency Park, because the project is under construction. We're very excited about it, and a lot of the images that I'm about to show you here are just a couple years away from being realized. So to revisit, we had these core buckets of programmatic elements: nature, culture, athletics, and play. We had extensive surveying. And we had all the metrics about how to prioritize all of these different types of amenities, right? So we've had the strategic planning, accomplished under guiding principle 1. We developed all of this hard data in guiding principle 2, and then here's how we really deployed it on the site in the design. So like most projects, there was a lot of iteration. There were more than a dozen, if not 24 iterations on what this park could look like in the early concept phases. I'm just going to show you the 2 favorites that came out of the public process. So we had one called Terrace and Trails, which was a little more civic focused. There's no defined athletic field area. It's more of a flexible open space on the west side of the park. The idea of a cultural terrace that housed building amenities and community gathering spaces, and then a more idyllic, park setting integrated with stormwater gardens. We felt it was important to keep consistent language. We always, presented to the public plan, section, axonometric, and elevation views consistent between all the design options. And we always told the stormwater story. Every drawing had a stormwater mirror to it, to show how it was functioning to meet the projects and the city's goals of flood mitigation and resiliency. So here you can see the early concepts about capturing perimeter roadway runoff into green infrastructure features, and then early ideas about gathering stormwater either below or at grade on the site. And then of course the large 1 million gallon flood mitigation tank that Megan showed everyone. So again, section view, always showing stormwater, plan, section, axonometric. The second one was this idea of forest and fields, had a little bit more stormwater, and again, worked in the big multi-purpose athletic field. We repeated the same visual language, looked to deploy the same type of gardens. You can see this one had a lot more surface bioretention than the previous one. Also took advantage of saying, hey, the athletic field could really serve a dual purpose and provide a lot of stormwater management. And again, there's the large 1 million gallon tank. We looked at it sectionally as well. And like most projects, in the end, when you have 2 designs, instead of picking one, your client usually says, what if we take a little bit of A and a little bit of B, and we marry those together? And of course, we're always more than happy to make our clients happy and do an extra round of work and come up with, something that really works for everyone. So, in the end, the athletic field was extremely important to this community. They weren't going to have another public parcel come available that they could fit something of that scale on. But we also really didn't want to lose the ideas of this civic terrace and having the stormwater gardens and flexible event space. So the scale of some things got rejiggered so it could all be accommodated. But in the end, we were really happy with the distribution and mix of programmatic elements that we were able to fit into this park. So we looked at everything again, kept the visual language consistent. And our stormwater at this point started to get a little more refined. You can see we're starting to think about where water comes in, where it comes out. We're starting to think about water reuse, if it was potential to use all of that water in the 1 million gallon tank. Different types of BMPs. Could we do some shallow, underground gravel storage that was working in tandem with the surface level bioretention features? So we're starting to get a little more sophisticated in the thinking, but we're still at the conceptual level. And then that brings us to the final plan and details. This is when we really, honed in. We started to get specific about what the various colors of green on the plan meant. What was a basketball court? What was a boardwalk? What type of striping was the athletic field going to have? How big was the community space and the cafe going to be? You can see we eventually worked in a fountain and ice rink feature. How big was the great lawn? We did a lot of studies on what size crowds could fit on that lawn, and then therefore what type of program or events the city could host at the park with that amount of square footage available to them. There's a movie theater built into the roof of the pavilion structure that can come down so people can watch movies on the lawn. So it was really a sophisticated design in the end that had all of those civic elements, the recreational elements, and all the stormwater. There's stormwater ringing the site, not only at the perimeter in bump outs, but every park entry is through the threshold of a bioretention feature. And you can see the finished aerial perspective. And then again, the stormwater perspective. And I really give the city credit. If you go to the site right now and look at the construction fence, both this image and this image are on the huge banner telling people what is going on at the park. So even through the construction, we really felt it was important in the messaging of this park to show people what was involved. And so you can see again, stormwater at all the thresholds. It's a major element on the site. We did follow through with planning underground storage shallowly under the athletic field. We ended up having two different reuse systems. There's a separate gray water reuse system attached to the building. And then all of the surface bioretention features overflow to a 50,000 gallon cistern tank, which is going to provide all of the irrigation on the site. And then finally, there is the large 1 million gallon tank, which buffers the entire sewer district in the area. So, we're really happy with that distribution of infrastructure and really felt like we were hitting kind of all of the check boxes of citywide, local neighborhood wide, and then on site. The park is really going to release no runoff in and of itself into the area, which is a huge relief on the tax CSO system. Looking at those thresholds, again, an example of an early rendering, looking at what the street corner could look like if all of the infrastructure was just kind of interior to the park, and then comparing it to what it could look like if it was both interior and exterior. We were very happy that, this version is the one we went with in the end. So, you're always passing through this gateway, this resilient gateway of green infrastructure coming and going from the park. Looking at each of the major programmatic elements, there is the athletic field, provides a large amount of storage underneath it. So water comes in, it infiltrates right through the synthetic turf surface into a gravel storage bed, and then that is slow released back into the cistern system for water reuse. It does not go back into the CSO system. It's very important we have a ring of infrastructure kind of making sure no water leaves the site to overtax the CSO system. On the other site, we had a play valley, a basketball basin, some lowland gardens. These are some of the more exciting amenities that we integrated green infrastructure into. So looking at the play valley, our consultant Studio Ludo did a fantastic job envisioning the play features. There's a stream through the middle, and again, there are low profile gravel bed of storage and drains below this. So there's different sand pits for play. This is a porous wood fiber mulch surface. So again, it basically acts as a sponge. All the water that falls on it is going to infiltrate right through the wood fibers into the below grade storage bed. And again, it's going to be slow released back into the cistern system for reuse. The basketball basin, I think everyone thought was one of the the cooler things that our team came up with. It was also one of the last amenities to be added. This was more of just a passive, garden seating area. And, the city council were really adamant, could we get another piece of athletic, active recreation programming in this park? And we were all thinking, where are we going to fit it? And we were like, it'd be great if we could get a basketball feature on here. And originally this entire corner was a large basin. And we were like, well, we can't afford to lose the stormwater storage if we have a basketball court. And we said, what if it's not a court and it's a basin? And that was kind of the big aha moment. And so the court is actually sunk down 2 feet. So you either ramp down to it or come down in steps. And so in dry weather, it'll function just the way any other court does. And in wet weather, it has 2 feet of storage that will slow release out through breaks in the retaining wall that surround it into adjacent bioretention basins. So the water gets stored, it gets slowly released and filtered, and ultimately when it leaves the basins, again, it goes back into the reuse system, into the cistern at the end of the day. Another look at that and kind of that perimeter wall. So we have regularly spaced perforations at the base of that wall to kind of regulate the slow release from the basin into the surrounding rain gardens. And we also, again, made the point that anything in the park could do double duty or triple or quadruple duty. So you could use the basin when it wasn't being used for basketball or for any other number of active rec elements as well. And then finally, kind of the most beautiful, dedicated rain garden or bioretention feature on the site is the Madison Lowland Garden. And here we just really wanted to make the point that these features, that a stormwater garden could be beautiful in and of itself. Going and presenting at the city council meetings throughout this project, it was an effort, especially at first, to get across the point that rain gardens, are not weed-filled areas that get left over at the end of a project and no one takes care of, that they are in and of themselves an amazing amenity, not just for people, but for the natural environment, pollinators, etc. And so here we have a deck system that meanders through the garden. It also kind of has an overlook area here where we concentrated particularly pollinator habitat. So we were kind of calling it the pollinator amphitheater, where we're envisioning people will come and sit and take in the park and, watch the butterflies kind of put on a show for them as they hang out in the garden. And finally, we kicked off construction last fall. It's been going strong all year. You saw some of the below grade infrastructure going in some of the slides that Megan showed earlier. Everyone on the team is really proud about that work. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention all of them. It really took a village on this one, and everyone contributed at a very high level to help realize this park. So that brings us to the question and answer period. Please type in anything if you want us to return to any slides. All right, we got our first one. Tom, do you have examples of specific tools or models? Tom, you took it away. Tools or examples to accommodate potential future peak runoff and climate conditions in GSI designs. Yes, so I think the best thing is to look at the projected rainfall data if you want to future-proof your site. So if you want to look at projected 2025 data or 2050 data or projected flood elevations, there's multiple parts to kind of answering that question. So from a flood management perspective, it's important to, I think, look at the sea level rise data. For rainfall data, you want to look at the NOAA rainfall data and get specific about your region. You want to find the nearest weather station and make sure you're pulling the most specific data that you can. And I think it's important to look at a long period. You saw in our rainfall graph that Megan showed, we looked at the previous 10 years of data. I think you want to take a large enough cross section that you're not getting any noise from an off year, either high or low, from a potential standard. And you're going to use the same routing calculations though, so you're still going to use your standard TR55 methodology. to do your routing calculations and see how your infrastructure is sized. You're just going to be plugging in that elevated data that's higher than what's currently in your regulatory bodies. Megan, do you want to take this one? Claire would like to know what the largest design constraint or hurdle was on the case study project.
Sure. I think that comes from the multiple regulatory agencies that we worked with, because they each had their own standards. So specifically looking at how site remediation interacted with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's Land Use and Water Quality Department. It was really trying to understand how we could accommodate the needs of all the different departments and design above and beyond what was required. So the stormwater system was very complex. That involved accommodating a cap underneath of it. We incorporated inches of clay, but we also needed to accommodate a large amount of storage. So that, as we went through the design process, we ended up incorporating low profile under drains that were only 1 inch high. And that allowed us to create more storage at the surface. We had to make basins larger in footprint and shallower in order to accommodate a groundwater table that was extremely high for the site. So those different features interacting with each other were the challenge, not one particular per se.
All right, great question from Matt. How can citizens support the increased use of green infrastructure to promote resiliency in their communities? I think, first of all, there's local champions in every area that we work. Locally in Philadelphia, the water department itself goes out and does a lot of community outreach to dispel myths about green infrastructure, explain how their stormwater incentives program works, and to encourage the understanding of the triple bottom line benefits of green infrastructure. The Sustainable Business Network is a great local network that is all about climate change action and resiliency. E&LP is a member of that. That group is doing a lot of effort at the local business level and community level. The Community Design Collaborative, local in Philadelphia, I would get involved. In New Jersey, there's, again, a number of either sister organizations to those or ones who do similar things. New Jersey Future has been a great partner of ours. We've released both a green infrastructure developers guide to green infrastructure, as well as a municipal toolkit with them to help different sectors and stakeholders take advantage of green infrastructure. And I think the biggest thing is education, and to understand that green infrastructure not only functionally solves a lot of issues, it's just as effective as gray infrastructure in terms of managing volume, water quality, and groundwater recharge, which are some of the key components when we're talking about stormwater management. It also has all the other benefits that gray infrastructure doesn't in meeting the triple bottom line. So, you get fantastic amenity spaces, you get economic benefits. It's been well documented, the increase in property values by having beautiful green infrastructure systems on your streetscape. So, I think education first, and reach out to all of the local groups that are really championing this approach to stormwater management.
Just to piggyback off of what Ed said, in terms of education, it's also start early. So in some Philadelphia schools, they're working to put green infrastructure into the schoolyard. And incorporating those elements, like Ed discussed, the stumpery, are really important to get kids to understand early on and bring that knowledge to their parents, to their families, really spread the knowledge early that green infrastructure is the future of stormwater design.
Yep. And that follows up great. Another follow-up question from Matt that ties right into what Megan is saying. What areas in Philadelphia could be developed? The Philadelphia schoolyards. A lot of them are seas of asphalt and broken and unsafe asphalt. None of them have much stormwater management in them, and the more schoolyards in the city that we could integrate green infrastructure into, the better. And the schoolyards want it. We've worked with a number of them through different nonprofits. And all the school principals that we speak to are dying for site amenities to be improved. They want safe play equipment. They want nature learning. They want outdoor playrooms and classrooms. And I think our design community can really help them in partnership with the school district and the water department to realize that.
I think a big concern with the schoolyards that people always bring up as an obstacle why they can't do green infrastructure is maintenance needs. And something that I think the community can address together. So looking at the program Tree Philly, where residents can get street trees in their neighborhood and care for them themselves. Programs like that are really important to the sustained effort of incorporating green infrastructure into public projects that don't have a lot of money.
Gardener. Matt, I hope you're a gardener. Here's you should dig into your soil a little bit and make sure that you have some good material. If you don't, or if it looks very clayey, integrate some compost and some topsoil to help promote infiltration. You could do something as simple as connect a rain barrel to your downspouts to reuse to water your garden or your lawn. You could try to limit the amount of lawn you have. One of the biggest contributors to runoff and nutrient pollution in our waterways. You could look into natural meadow grasses or pollinator gardens in lieu of a more traditional lawn. And you can also work in a rain garden around your perimeter. Find the low spot on your property, and there are great tools on the water department's website for kind of straightforward plants that you could find at any nursery to help plant back there. You can also feel free to email Megan or I, and we will help you with plant selection as well. Tom, specific water quality metrics in the Resiliency Park. Yes, so New Jersey has very specific water quality standards. There's a water quality storm, 1.25 inches that needs to be managed. And there's also TSS removal, so total suspended solids. So the bioretention systems and the soil specification needed to meet at least 80% removal rate for TSS. And we needed to show that it could manage at least a 1.5 inch storm. So the park was, there were two different things. So the bioretention features along the perimeter that were receiving roadway runoff, it was extremely important that those had the proper residence time in the bioretention bump outs and got the benefit of being filtered through the full soil profile. More internal to the park, runoff from pedestrian parkways that's not being exposed to the same type of hazards as a vehicular roadway have a little bit less stringent standards. Regardless, still went through the same type of BMP treatment train that the rest did. And then of course, everything gets to settle out in any of the large tanks on site, whether it's the cistern or the 1 million gallon tank, before they're ultimately re-released into a waterway. And you should always check your local jurisdictions. Like the water quality storm in Philadelphia is different than New Jersey. And some of the TSS removal rates or phosphorus loading rates also vary from regulatory agency to regulatory agency. So always check first, but those are kind of the main things that you're always looking for from a water quality perspective. So other projects to look at. We didn't talk much about green roofs today. If you want to see some cool green roof projects, there are tons of local projects. You know, the Pico building, Sierra Green, that you can look at if you're local to Philadelphia. If you're in New Jersey, come up to Hoboken. We have a project going in on Clinton Street, Clinton and 8th. called Wonderlost, which has extensive both sedum and intensive green roof areas that are basically serving as the public amenity space for all of the condos and loft units. Those are ones. Go to different schools and universities. Penn, Drexel, Temple, locally all have really fantastic examples of green infrastructure. So it's easy to find. If you're looking for additional guidance, it's up on the screen now, a stormwater guidance page where we kind of capture some of the videos you saw today, as well as another 4 or 5 that we didn't incorporate that kind of hit on different key topics. Also address different stakeholder groups. So if you're a designer, you might find some videos more useful than others. If you work at a municipality or a city agency, you might find other ones more helpful. So we really tried to, have a wide spread of interactive elements to provide guidance. And we just really want to champion kind of the approach of using green infrastructure and resilient practices in public space design. And think of it as more than just stormwater management. I kind of always like to make the point that these features are only going to be wet in this area of the country for maybe 60 individual rainfall events a year. So that's a lot of time where the rain is not falling in them, that they are there. And they should have a purpose during those other 300 days of the year to your site and the area that you're installing them. So I think it's really important for the design community to keep that in mind and address that in their planning and their implementation. And if we don't have any other questions, thank you for everyone who has stuck with us this far. And we're very excited to give this presentation. Reach out to Megan or I individually. By all means, we're happy to talk shop on green infrastructure and resiliency. And check out the webpage. We're hoping everyone really finds the content useful and interesting.
Thank you, everyone.